Hi friends, in this series we are developing a full stack application using Angular 7 and Spring Boot. In previous tutorial we had implemented basic authentication for the Angular 7 Spring Boot application. In the Angular code for all the outgoing HTTP requests, we were hard coding the headers that are required for basic authentication. Though the code is functional, but it is not the most optimum approach. So in this tutorial we'll be implementing HTTP interceptors where we'll be intercepting all the outgoing HTTP requests, and it is here that we'll be adding the basic authentication headers that are required for the Angular code. For this I'll be taking reference of my website javanews.com. So go to Angular 7 tutorials. So this is the tutorial that we are going to implement, Angular 7 Spring Boot basic auth using HTTP interceptor example. I'll be sharing this URL along with a YouTube video. So in the previous tutorial we had implemented Angular 7 and Spring Boot basic auth example. So this was the tutorial that we had implemented. Here for all the Angular HTTP calls we were adding the logic for basic auth when making the HTTP calls. So for get employees, delete employees, create employees, so for each of these HTTP calls we were adding this basic auth logic. Similarly in the authentication service, where during login we have to authenticate a user, here also we were using the basic auth logic. So this authentication logic, it was getting duplicated at various places, and we were using hard-coded username and password when making these CRUD HTTP calls. So in this tutorial what we'll be doing is we'll be adding a HTTP interceptor. The HTTP interceptor, it will have the logic of adding the basic auth headers that are required for the HTTP calls in order to pass the basic authentication. So all the outgoing HTTP requests, they will be intercepted by this HTTP interceptor, and we'll be adding that logic, and then the call will be forwarded to the Spring Boot code where we are implementing basic authentication. So let's begin with the implementation part. We'll be modifying the code that we had developed in the previous tutorial. So in the previous tutorial we had implemented this basic authentication along with Angular 7. If you'll go here below, you will find the source code links here. So for Angular 7 I have uploaded the code to GitHub. You can download it from here, and Spring Boot basic auth code you can download it by clicking on this link. Angular 7 code imported in the Visual Studio Code IDE. So this is the Visual Studio Code IDE. So previously code that we had developed, we had this login component. This login component HTML used to take the username and password from the user, and the login component, it would pass this username and password to the authenticate service that we have written here. So this authenticate service is where we made the HTTP calls to the Spring Boot application for validating a user using the username and password. So here we are creating the authorization headers needed for basic authentication and adding them before making the HTTP calls. Similarly we have the HTTP client service. So from here we are making the HTTP calls for performing the CRUD operation. So here we have delete employee, create employee. Similarly we have the get employees here. So in all these requests we are using the hard-coded username javanews as the username and password as password. So while making these CRUD calls we are making use of this hard-coded username and password, which is not a good thing. So go to the command prompt, go to the location where you have this project, and using the command ngserve start the application. Similarly go to the Spring Boot application, and we'll be starting this by running this as a Java application. So the Spring Boot application, it has started successfully. Go to localhost 4200. Username I'll put it as javanews. The password I'll just put it as password. Click on login. So we are able to log in successfully. We can add an employee and view employee. So this was the application that we developed previously. Now let's begin with the modification of the code. In our existing code, whenever the user enters the username and password, this is passed to the login component, and the login component, it makes use of the authentication service authenticate method. So here we have the authenticate method where the HTTP call is made to the Spring Boot application for authenticating a particular user. So here we are adding the headers to this while making this validate login call to validate a particular user. If this validate login call is successful, what we are doing is in the session storage we are storing this username, and we make use of this username in the session storage to know if a particular user is logged in or not, and also on logout we clear the session storage of this username. Now the change that we'll be making is, along with storing this username in the session storage, if the call to validate login is successful, we'll also be storing the basic auth string, that is this string here, in the session storage. So if the call is successful, we know that this is the username and password that we have to use when making a call to the Spring Boot application for basic authentication. So we'll be storing this complete string in session storage. So this is the change that we are going to make in the session storage. Along with the username, we'll also be storing this basic auth, and this basic auth is nothing but the authentication string that we are creating using the username and password. Now this is done only if the call to the validate login is successful. Only then this code gets executed. So once we have stored this auth string in the session storage, next we'll implement the HTTP interceptor provided by the Angular library, which will intercept all the outgoing HTTP calls. We'll be implementing the intercept method of the HTTP interceptor. So here in the intercept method, we'll check if the session storage it has a valid username and basic auth string. If it does not have a valid username and basic auth string, it means that this authentication service, it has authenticate method, it has still not been called and the user has still not logged in. So in that case, this basic auth headers, it will not be added to the outgoing HTTP calls. But if in the session storage there is a valid username and basic auth, it means that yes, the user has logged in. And in that case, what we'll be doing is that for all the outgoing HTTP calls, we'll be adding the authorization header by making use of this basic auth string here, and then the HTTP calls, they will be forwarded to the Spring Boot application. Also, since the HTTP requests that we get in this intercept method, since they are immutable, therefore we cannot modify them. Therefore we are cloning the HTTP request and then adding the headers that we need. Once this change has been made, then for the CRUD calls we'll not need to add the header information when making the calls, because these CRUD calls for get employees, delete employee and create employee, they will be intercepted by the HTTP interceptor, and the required headers, they will be added in this intercept method. So let us make these changes. We'll begin with the authentication service. So in the authenticate method, along with the username, we'll also be storing the auth string in the session storage. So go to the authentication service. So here we are just storing the username. We'll also need to store the basic auth string. So this is the code that we'll need to add. Here we get the authentication string and we add it in the session storage. So add these 2 lines of code here. Next we'll be creating the HTTP interceptor service. So go to the location where your code is, and the command for generating a service is ng-generate service. Since we are generating all the services in the service folder, /service, and I'll be giving the name as basic auth HTTP interceptor. So this will generate a service for us. So go to the new service that is generated. So this is a service that is generated for us. Let us modify this. So it should implements HTTP interceptor. We'll have to import this HTTP interceptor. Also now it will be giving an exception since we have to implement the intercept method. So copy this intercept method here. Import this HTTP request. Similarly, we'll need to import the HTTP handler, which is also there in the Angular library. Next we'll need to register the HTTP interceptor that we just created by updating the provider section of the app.module.ts. So go to this app.module.ts, and here go to the provider section. So here we have the provider section. Currently there is nothing here, so copy this. In the providers we have specified the HTTP interceptor, so copy this, go here in curly brackets, and here we are specifying the HTTP interceptor class, which is the basic auth HTTP interceptor service that we have just created. Also import this HTTP interceptors. So we are done with the code changes. The only thing left now is we'll need to remove this hard-coded basic authentication headers that we had added here. So for all these CRUD operations, remove this header code that we have here. Similarly, we don't need to pass this headers when making the HTTP call. So do this for all the 3 HTTP calls that we are making. And also we'll need to remove these headers from here. And also from delete employee I'll need to remove it. So we are done with all the changes. If we go to the command prompt, and here we'll see that our ngserve, it is not showing any compiler errors, so we have made the changes correctly. Now let us test if our application is working properly. The Spring Boot application, it has started. So here I'll put the username as Java in use. The password I'll put it as password. On login I'm able to see the list of employees correctly. Similarly, add employee, I'll just add a new employee, maybe test designation architect, employee ID 55, employee created successfully. If I go to view employees, here I'm able to see this test employee. So our application, it is working correct. For all the outgoing HTTP calls, the HTTP interceptor, it is adding the required basic auth headers correctly. I hope you have understood this tutorial. The source code for this, you can download it from here. I have uploaded it to GitHub. Thank you.